Sometimes the loudest legacy is the one that never needed to speak. When an old man with a limp and a battered cane steps out of a dusty Impala at a military base in Montana, no one looks twice. To the recruits sweating through drills, he's just another visitor. Someone's grandpa with stories no one asked to hear, but Private Jake Lawrence knows better. That quiet man with steel in his eyes and years on his shoulders once held a rifle like a lifeline, and never missed when it mattered most. What happens next isn't a tale of revenge, fame, or redemption. It's about a moment, a single perfect shot that slices through more than a target. It cuts through time, memory, and the fragile ego of youth. And when the truth comes to light, a base falls silent, a record is reborn, and a generation begins to understand that strength doesn't always march. It sometimes just watches. This is the story of Walt Lawrence, a man who walked away from medals, but never from duty. A man who taught others not by shouting, but by aiming true. They handed him a rifle, dusty, worn, not out of respect, but because handing it over felt like the polite thing to do. A few of the younger recruits chuckled, already bracing for the old man to fumble. And fumble he did. The first shot missed. The instructor smirked and leaned toward a nearby soldier, muttering, "Let's not waste too much ammo on him." But the old man wasn't rattled. No frustration, no shame, just a stillness about him. He adjusted his stance, lifted the rifle again. This time he didn't shake. No hurry, no hesitation, just one slow breath, in silence. The shot cracked through the still afternoon air, and everything stopped. The entire range fell still, like the world held its breath. The bullet had split the target, dead center. A perfect shot. Not just good, flawless. No mistake, no second guess. And when the base commander arrived a few minutes later, he didn't speak at first. He simply took off his cap and looked at the man in front of him. Quietly, almost reverently, he said the name engraved on the old fading plaque hanging inside the base. "It never faded," the commander said. "And today, neither did your aim." He was the man behind a 40-year shooting record that no one had been able to touch. Until now, until he came back. A living legend no one recognized, until he reminded them who he was. The sun had only just begun lifting the last of the morning chill from the grass at Camp Whitmore, a modest army base tucked into the endless golden plains of central Montana. Wind hissed softly through the pines, brushing past gravel roads and the open-air shooting range. A group of new recruits were already deep into their morning drills, sweat clinging to their brows as instructors shouted commands. In the distance, the clanging of steel targets rang out in rhythm with the barking of orders. For most of the young men and women there, it was just another day in basic training, another challenge, another push. But not for Private Jake Lawrence. Something about this morning felt heavier, more electric. His eyes kept darting toward the front gate, scanning the road between exercises. And then he saw it. An old, dust-caked Chevrolet Impala rolled up slowly, its faded blue paint dulled from time and stubbornness. It coughed to a stop near the range, trailing a thin cloud of dust behind it. The door opened, and out stepped a tall, lean man, weathered upright despite the years, his back stiff, his jaw square. Walt Lawrence, Jake's grandfather. He stood there in a well-kept corduroy jacket and pressed slacks, a flat wool cap pulled low over his eyes. In one hand, he held a dented metal thermos of black coffee. In the other, a cane that had clearly walked thousands of miles, both literal and metaphorical. Jake didn't wait. The moment his instructor gave the nod, he broke from formation and jogged over, chest rising with pride and nerves. His grin was uneven, tugged up by emotion. "Grandpa, you made it." Walt's lips curved into a barely there smile. 3 hours on I-90, and the last stretch was all gravel, he said, glancing toward the dust still settling behind his car. "But I made it. Had to see if these folks are teaching you kids the right way." A few recruits across the field took notice. One elbowed the other and whispered with a smirk, "Who's that? Grandpa or G.I. Joe?" The group laughed lightly. Nothing mean-spirited, just the usual way the young brush off what they don't understand. Walt didn't respond. Maybe he didn't hear. Or maybe he did and simply didn't care. His eyes were elsewhere, scanning the base with quiet recognition, like someone stepping back into an old memory. Sergeant Holden, one of the instructors, a straight shooter in his late 30s with a sharp voice and sharper instincts, approached Jake. "Private Lawrence, this your guest?" Jake straightened immediately. "Yes, sir. My grandfather, sir. He used to serve." Holden gave a slow nod. "He's welcome to observe. Just keep him behind the line. It's marksmanship day. Gets loud." Walt answered with a respectful nod. "Understood. I won't get in the way." Jake returned to his group. Walt, meanwhile, found a folding metal chair near the edge of the range. He sat slowly, setting his cane between his knees, hands resting lightly atop it. The sunlight hit his face, catching the silver in his stubble and the deep-set calm in his eyes. He looked like a forgotten piece of history. Most of the recruits barely spared him a second glance. Just another old man with a connection. But Jake knew better. And by the end of the day, so would everyone else. By early afternoon, the heat had begun to settle in. The dry Montana air thickened with the scent of gun oil, sweat, and hot metal. The marksmanship test was underway now. Targets stood rigid and quiet across the field. Recruits rotated through the line, each firing under the critical eye of instructors. Some missed wildly, others barely clipped their marks. A few, like Jake, showed promise. Tight groups, good posture. Walt hadn't moved much. He remained seated near the edge, sipping his coffee in slow, measured sips. He hadn't said much since arriving, but there was something in his stillness, something unspoken but unmistakable. He was waiting, watching, and the moment was coming. Walt stood with a posture that didn't invite conversation. He wasn't there to pass the time, and it showed in the way he watched Lane 9, the forgotten one near the far wall where old test rifles were kept for calibration or the occasional dry run. No one was using it. It sat quiet, unnoticed by most, waiting for purpose. That's when Sergeant Daniels strolled by. He was young, full of swagger, the kind who had more jokes than wisdom, more talk than ears. He spotted Walt standing still but focused, and tossed a question with a grin. "You ever shoot, old-timer?" Walt tilted his head slightly. "Used to, long time ago." Daniels glanced toward the bolt-action rifle resting on the bench. It was more of a museum piece than a tool these days, used mostly for show or drills without ammo. "Well, lane's open. Want to give it a try? Just for fun?" A few feet away, Jake heard it. His muscles stiffened, a jolt running through him. His jaw clenched instinctively. He didn't have to look to know they were talking about his grandfather, and he knew, yes, Walt used to shoot, used to be sharp, steady, but that was before. Before the accident, before the surgeries, before time did what it always does. It dulled the edges, wore things down. Walt hadn't picked up a rifle in years, not since the pain changed him. But Walt stood, quietly, without hesitation. He walked toward Lane 9 like he belonged there, like that patch of ground still knew his boots. Jake's heartbeat kicked up as he watched. He wasn't ready for what this meant. Not just a shot at a target, but something deeper. Something personal. Walt leaned his cane against the bench, rolled his shoulder, slow and cautious, working out the stiffness. Then he picked up the rifle. Every motion was deliberate, not rushed, like a man walking back into a memory he hadn't visited in years. Around him, a few recruits noticed and began whispering, "Is he actually gonna shoot? Better have a medic on standby." Daniels laughed under his breath, clearly amused. "All right, sir, let's see what you got." Walt said nothing. He adjusted his glasses, narrowed his eyes downrange, let out a breath, and pulled the trigger. The shot cracked clean through the air, but the laughter came just as fast. A miss. Not a near miss, not a graze of the edge. Off the board entirely. Daniel smirked, leaned toward a recruit. "Let's not waste too much ammo, huh?" Jake's face went red, heat blooming behind his ears. He couldn't look at anyone. Couldn't even find the words to defend his grandfather. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. But this wasn't a moment for speeches. This was one of those moments where silence clung to your skin heavier than noise. Walt didn't flinch. He didn't hang his head. He just slowly set the rifle back on the bench, thoughtful, eyes distant. Not ashamed, not wounded, just listening. to something no one else could hear. A breath, a beat. Then barely above a whisper, he said one more arrow. Daniels blinked. Sir? Walt didn't look at him. His voice came again, clearer. One more. This time something shifted. He wasn't asking anymore. He wasn't pleading, just stating. Two words that didn't need decoration. One more, like a truth already written. Daniels hesitated, teetering on the edge of mockery. But there was something in the way Walt said it. Calm, sure, finished, like a man who'd already accepted the result, whatever it might be. That steadiness made the sergeant pause. He exchanged a look with another instructor, who gave a half shrug. Daniel sighed. All right, one more. Walt stepped back into position. Jake didn't move. His own rifle hung loose in his hands as he watched, like he was seeing his grandfather for the first time. Not the man with a cane, not the man the years had bent, but someone else, someone older, yes, but not smaller. Around them, the chatter stopped. The smirks faded. A quiet took over, the kind that prickles your skin because everyone feels something coming, but no one can name it. Walt held the rifle differently this time. Not tighter, just with purpose. He adjusted his stance. One foot behind the other, shoulders squared. His knees didn't tremble now. The cane, still resting on the bench, seemed like it belonged to someone else entirely. He ran a thumb along the stock, slow and deliberate, like tracing a groove etched by time and use. A memory, worn into the grain. Then silence again. Not the hollow kind, but thick and full. Heavy with meaning. Walt inhaled, exhaled, in, out. Like this wasn't new, like he'd done it 1,000 times, because he had. Not here, not today, but long ago in places no one in that room had ever seen. There was no fear, no hope for praise, no tension. Just a man and his breath. Just a memory and a rifle. The weight of that rifle was more than just metal and wood. It carried the memory of men who'd staked their lives on its aim. In moments of life and death, in places where seconds mattered and silence was the difference between survival and a name etched on a wall, it had been trusted. Now, in hands older than the weapon itself, it rose again. Walt brought it up with calm precision. His cheek rested gently against the stock, his eye fixed down the scope. Far ahead, the target waited. The Montana air stilled like it knew something rare was about to happen. The world around him, full of chatter and doubt moments before, fell into a hushed tunnel. All that existed was the sight and the line drawn between him and the center of that distant bullseye. Click, bang. The sound wasn't loud in itself, but it rolled through the range like thunder striking over a still lake. Then came the quiet. Not the kind that follows any shot, but the kind that stretches thin across every inch of air. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Jake didn't breathe. No one did. Sergeant Daniels, who had worn a smirk like armor all morning, stepped forward stiffly. His usual swagger gone, he bent to the range scope and peered through it as if what he saw would rewrite everything he believed. His back straightened, his shoulders froze. His mouth parted slightly, but nothing came out. Hit, someone whispered. Daniels didn't acknowledge it. He stepped away silently and gestured for another instructor to take a look. Then another. One after the next, they leaned into the scope and came away with the same wide-eyed stillness. A younger recruit finally raised his binoculars. He gasped. Bullseye's torn. Dead center. Dead center, he said. The target hadn't been nicked or nearly clipped. It had been split, clean, surgical, like someone had sliced it with a razor. It trembled in the breeze now, cut in two. Walt lowered the rifle slowly. No nod, no grin. He didn't look smug. He just turned toward Jake and in a quiet voice that didn't ask for attention, said, "That'll do." No one spoke. The silence didn't just linger. It deepened. It changed. It became reverence. The recruits weren't standing like before. Their casual postures had vanished, shoulders straightening, hands falling still. Even Sergeant Daniels had taken a few steps back, arms now folded, his expression unreadable. Across the range, leaning against the side of the command shack, a figure had frozen mid-step. His uniform was worn, his hair a mess of gray and grit. The name tag on his chest read, Clayton. a master sergeant, nearly retired. The kind of soldier who'd seen enough, done enough, and forgotten more than most of these kids would ever know. But right now, Clayton wasn't moving. He was staring at the man in lane 9 like he'd just seen a ghost. He murmured, mostly to himself, Lawrence, Walt Lawrence. The name stirred something old and buried deep, more than a rumor, a record, a legend with proof. Without another word, Clayton turned and made his way across the gravel toward the main control building. The structure was older, weather-beaten, the flagpole out front leaning, its flag faded. Inside, it smelled of time. Old paper, dry wood, and dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. He sat down heavily at a desk where a computer, ancient by today's standards, rumbled to life like it resented being disturbed. With thick fingers, Clayton typed, Lawrence Walter, Fort Liberty, 1980s. The screen blinked slowly. One match found. He clicked. A scan file loaded, grainy and yellowed at the edges, but clear. It was him. A black and white photo of a much younger Walt Lawrence. Sun-darkened skin, lean frame, kneeling beside a split target that looked nearly identical to the one fluttering outside right now. Below it, Fort Liberty marksmanship record, 1983. Longest standing open-range bullseye shot, 200 meters. Confirmed 1 shot, 1 kill. Wind variable, none. Clayton kept scrolling, his hand stopped. An after-action and report, everyone, brief and raw. During recon patrol, Lawrence engaged from high ground without orders. Neutralized 3 hostile units, drawing fire to cover wounded team. Held position 43 minutes. Rescued 2 pinned soldiers under suppressive fire. Refused citation. Declined Bronze Star. Clayton stared at the screen in silence. Then he reached for the printer. The machine creaked as it came to life, humming like it understood the gravity of the moment. A single sheet rolled out slowly. He took it with care, folded it once, like it was something sacred. Outside, the recruits had started whispering again, but everything about their tone had shifted. Who is he? Wait, what did the instructor call him? Lawrence, that's him. That's the guy. Even Daniels had gone quiet. He stood, staring at the torn bullseye, eyes narrowed, not with disbelief, but something closer to awe. Like he couldn't decide if what he'd seen had humbled him or challenged him. Jake stood a little off to the side, caught between a pride he didn't fully understand and a growing sense that the man he thought he knew, his quiet, fence-fixing grandfather, had once been someone else entirely. He drank his coffee black, no cream, no sugar, just like always. Never in his wildest thoughts did he imagine he'd one day be standing on a military range again, surrounded by young recruits, his name whispered in tones of awe by people who hadn't even been born when he made his mark. Clayton came out of the control building, holding a printout tightly in his hand. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply walked over and handed the sheet to Sergeant Daniels. Daniels glanced at the header, furrowed his brow, and then slowly lifted his eyes toward Walt, who was quietly wiping down the rifle, treating it like an old friend before tucking it back into its worn canvas sleeve. Daniels took a step forward, voice tinged with disbelief. Sir, is this you? Walt didn't answer right away. He zipped the case shut, took a breath, and looked up through his weathered glasses. It was, he said simply. No bravado, no chest-thumping pride, just the plain truth. And in that instant, something subtle but unmistakable shifted. The recruits, the instructors, even the ones who'd been rolling their eyes earlier, stood a little taller. The silence around the range thickened, heavy with recognition. That bullseye Walt had split clean through wasn't just a lucky shot anymore. It had become a symbol, proof that history was not just written in textbooks, but living, breathing, right in front of them. The murmurs started quietly, then grew, rippling across the field like wind through tall grass. He's the one. Fort Liberty sniper. Saved an entire unit. But Walt, he didn't react. Maybe he didn't hear them. Or maybe he had long ago learned not to need the noise of applause. The gravel outside Camp Whitmore's firing range crunched under the weight of heavy tires. Heads turned, a black SUV, sleek and unmarked except for its government plates and a small American flag decal, rolled to a halt beside the command post. The door opened with a decisive click, and out stepped a tall man in immaculate fatigues. Colonel Richard Monroe, base commander. He didn't shout or demand attention. He didn't have to. His presence alone shifted the air. Recruits snapped to posture. Instructors stood silent. Even Daniels, who had been full of smirks and skepticism earlier, stepped aside, his expression now unreadable. But Monroe didn't go to the staff. He didn't say a word. His gaze landed directly on the older man sitting near lane 9, who was calmly twisting the cap back onto his thermos, as if nothing out of the ordinary had just occurred. With steady steps, Monroe walked toward Walt Lawrence. No rush, no flare. The wind tugged at the hem of his coat as he stopped just a few feet away. Walt looked up slowly. The colonel held still for a beat longer than anyone expected. Then, with quiet intention, he reached up and removed his cap. "Sir," he said in a low voice, thick with meaning, "we've kept your plaque inside for 40 years, right above the range office. Every year, someone brings up your name, but most of us, we didn't even know you were still alive." Walt nodded slowly, not just acknowledging the statement, but all the time it carried with it. "I wasn't trying to be remembered," he said plainly. Monroe studied him, saying nothing for a long second. Then his eyes shifted toward the distant paper target still fluttering slightly at the end of the lane. "That shot today," Monroe said, voice clipped but reverent. "That wasn't luck." He looked back at Walt. "You never missed when it counted." Walt didn't respond with a smile. He didn't protest or dismiss it. He just took another sip from his thermos, gazing out across the field like whatever he was thinking about lived far beyond this place. The wind came back, brushing through the trees and the rows of recruits. With it came something quieter, deeper than admiration. Respect. Not the kind earned with medals or headlines, but the kind you feel in your bones. Even the youngest recruits, who had laughed earlier, were silent now. Their faces said everything and nothing at once. Jake, standing in the back, felt something rise in his chest, something warm, unfamiliar. Not pride in a score or a skill, but in the man himself. The humility, the integrity, the kind of life that doesn't ask for applause, but earns it anyway. Monroe extended his hand. Walt hesitated only a moment, then rose without his cane and shook it. The colonel gave a single, quiet nod, then said, "If it's all right with you, sir, we'd like to hang that target next to your plaque." Walt glanced toward the range, then back at Monroe. "It's just a piece of paper." The colonel gave a faint smile. "That's not what it means." Walt gave a small shrug. "Do what you need to do." And with that, he sat back down. The moment passed like a wave, but in its wake, it left a silence so full of meaning, no ceremony could match it. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the Montana pines, casting long, slanted shadows across the gravel paths between the weathered tan barracks of Camp Whitmore. The gun range had finally fallen silent. The recruits had already been dismissed for chow, but Jake had quietly opted out of dinner, and so had Walt. Together, they walked back toward the edge of the barracks, not saying much. Their footsteps crunched softly over the gravel, but otherwise they shared the same wordless stillness that had hovered over the range just hours earlier. Inside the nearly empty common room, dim and hushed, Jake dragged two old folding chairs toward the back corner near a dusty, cracked window. Walt lowered himself onto one of them with the slow stiffness of someone who carried more than just age in his bones. He set his canvas rifle bag down beside him and reached into the side pocket without a word. "You ever wonder," he began, his voice quiet like he was speaking into the air more than to Jake, "why I never talked about any of it?" Jake turned to look at him, eyes steady. "Every day, Grandpa." Walt gave a slight nod and pulled out a worn leather folder. The corners were frayed, the surface cracked from years of handling, something that had clearly traveled far and been through more than most things should. He opened it slowly, unfolding it like a memory being allowed to breathe again, and laid it flat on the small metal table between them. Inside, tucked beneath a sheet of protective plastic, was an old photo, its colors faded, the edges sun-bleached. It showed a younger Walt, barely older than Jake was now, crouching in a muddy field. Two other soldiers were beside him, one with a makeshift bandage wrapped around his head, the other slumped in a wheelchair, raising what was left of his right arm in a salute. Walt's uniform in the photo bore no medals, no ribbons, just a smeared face and eyes that looked too tired for someone that young to be carrying. Jake picked up the photo carefully, almost reverently. This, this is you, he whispered. Who are the other guys? Walt took in a long, measured breath. The one standing, he was Lieutenant Parker. Good kid. Took a hit during that mission. The other, he glanced at the man in the wheelchair. That's Corporal Dominguez. We dragged him out from under a flipped transport truck. He never walked again. Jake looked closer. Behind the photo, tucked like an afterthought, was a torn newspaper headline. Sniper rescues wounded under fire. Declines citation. You saved them, Jake asked, eyes wide with something between awe and disbelief. I tried, Walt replied. His voice carried a heaviness that no amount of training could ever prepare someone for. Only Parker made it through the week. He leaned back slowly, the years catching up to him all at once, eyes turning distant, as though the room had faded and he was somewhere else entirely. That day, he murmured, I took the shot that ended the ambush. Got us out. They called me a hero after that, but it didn't feel like a win, Jake. It felt like a trade. I walked out. Some didn't. He paused, letting the words settle like dust in the corners of the room. That changes how you see yourself. Jake stayed quiet, letting the weight of it all fill the silence between them. I stopped competing after that, Walt went on. Didn't go back to the sniper program. Didn't chase medals or stripes or promotions. I just trained, helped the younger ones, stayed behind the line. Why? Jake asked softly. Because I was good at it, Walt said, his eyes not leaving the photo. Too good. And when you're good at something that's tied to loss, it stops feeling like a skill, starts feeling like a burden. Jake stared at the image again, the stillness of it louder now. But you saved lives, he said quietly. Walt finally looked him in the eyes. That doesn't always balance the scale. They sat there, the stillness now a kind of understanding. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I wish I'd known. Walt gave a small, worn smile. You know now. That's enough. Then Jake did something he hadn't done in years. He leaned forward and wrapped his arms around his grandfather. There were no words, just that quiet embrace, filled with everything words couldn't say. And there on the table, between the worn rifle bag and the faded photo, rested the quiet truth of a man who never sought the spotlight. Just a reason to aim again. The next morning, a thick fog still hung low over Camp Whitmore. Dew clung to the grass like it didn't want to let go, and the metal benches along the firing lanes glistened beneath the dim light of early dawn. The whole camp felt too quiet, too peaceful for yelling, too still for the sharp rhythms of drills. But Lane 9 was already prepped and ready. 4 recruits stood in a row, shoulder to shoulder. Their hands fumbled a little with their rifles. They shifted their weight nervously, adjusting their stances. They were the same 4 who had laughed yesterday. Now, not one of them cracked a smile. Walt sat just a few steps behind them, resting on an old wooden bench, sipping black coffee from a dented thermos. He wasn't barking orders, wasn't giving feedback, didn't even have a weapon on him. But the recruits knew, every one of them, that he was watching. Jake stood a few feet away, clipboard in hand. His stance was calm, his gaze sharp but not harsh. He didn't shout instructions either. He just quietly passed along what Walt had been teaching him all these years, lesson by lesson, shot by shot. Lessons unfolded in the hush of calm afternoons. Don't fight the wind, Walt had once said, voice low like a shared secret. Work with it. Let the rifle be part of your breath. And now, without saying a word, that lesson lingered in the air. One by Indimecan, the recruits took their shots. They missed, adjusted, fired again. Slowly, the bullets began to find their mark. Not perfectly, not dead center every time, but tighter, more controlled. The hesitation began to fade. Walt didn't move much. He sat quietly on the bench at the edge of the range, hands steady on his coffee, body relaxed like a man with nothing left to prove. But every time a recruit landed a clean shot, his eyes narrowed just a bit, barely noticeable, unless you were looking. A subtle nod, no applause, no praise. But the message was clear. That'll do. The young men began to feel his presence, not looming or critical, but more like a guide, calm and constant. A quiet reminder of what discipline could build. Jake stepped up beside his grandfather in the pause between rounds. "They're listening now," he said softly. Walt didn't even glance at him. "They're trying," he replied. There was a difference, and Walt made sure Jake knew it. Just a couple lanes over, Sergeant Daniels leaned against a post, arms crossed over his chest, silently observing. Since yesterday, he hadn't said much, still digesting the moment when the old man had stunned the range with a single perfect shot. The smugness that had once lingered on his face was gone now, replaced by something else. Curiosity, respect maybe, or just wonder. How had this quiet old man reached these recruits without giving a single order? After a few more rounds, one of the youngest, Mason, barely 19 and still unsure in his own boots, lowered his rifle. He turned awkwardly toward the bench. "Sir?" he called out, almost shy. "Am I holding it right? I keep drifting left." Walt looked up from his cup, didn't smile, didn't speak right away. Then he raised one hand, not to wave, but to motion him closer. Mason approached like a student who hadn't done his homework, standing awkwardly in front of Walt, waiting. Walt tapped his shoulder lightly. "You're not leaning into the rifle," he said in a tone as even as the wind. "You're resisting it. Let it settle into you." Mason blinked, trying to absorb that. "Relax," Walt added, a nod from Mason. Walt returned it, barely. "You're trying to dominate." "But," he continued, "that's not how good shots happen. Trust the stance. Let the rifle be an extension, not a fight." Mason walked back to his lane, lined up, fired, bullseye. He exhaled, surprised, and turned to look at Walt. The old man didn't cheer. He didn't even shift in his seat, just gave that same simple nod. That was all Mason needed. By the time the sun had climbed high, each of the 4 recruits had logged their best rounds of training so far. They weren't marksmen yet, but today they believed they could be. And Walt? He never touched a rifle. He didn't have to. His lessons had already found new hands, new shoulders, new breath. He wasn't passing on knowledge with instructions, but through something deeper. Quiet presence, precision, and patience. The kind that lasted. By late morning, the range began to clear. The recruits packed up, slinging rifles over their shoulders, chatting in low voices, some still glancing back toward the bench. Walt Lawrence remained exactly where he'd been, quiet, finishing his coffee, watching the wind through the trees instead of the young men leaving. The sun had warmed the air. It felt like the edge of summer. Walt didn't seem to notice. Crunching footsteps approached across the gravel. Sergeant Daniels stood nearby, cap in hand, not saying anything at first, just standing still, like words weren't easy to come by. Walt didn't look at him, to him. He already knew who it was. Eventually, Daniels cleared his throat. "Sir, I wanted to say something." Walt's eyebrow lifted slightly, but he didn't speak. Daniels shifted awkwardly. "Yesterday, I assumed. I looked at you and figured you were just tagging along. A visitor. I didn't realize I was standing next to the reason half our training manuals even exist." At that, Walt finally turned, met his eyes. There was no pride in his face, no resentment either, just calm, the kind that only comes from years of watching people grow into understanding. "We all do," Walt said simply, "until we learn not to." Daniels looked down for a second, nodded slowly. "Fair enough." There wasn't much else to say. Walt extended his hand. Daniels took it. A solid grip, mutual respect, plain and clear. Daniels turned to leave, but paused halfway. "Just so you know, the target you hit yesterday, we framed it. It's going up next to the 1983 plaque." Walt raised an eyebrow again, faintly amused. "Still had that plaque, huh?" Daniels smirked. "We do now." Back in the range office, the staff had already mounted the new frame on the wall. It was simple, just a clean target with a single perfect hole torn through the center. Beneath it, a small brass plate. Walter Lawrence had returned. Fort Liberty, 1983. That was the last time. And now, in 2023, he stood once again on the soil that had shaped him. No ceremonies awaited him. No reporters. No rows of medals glinting under stage lights. Just a small framed target hung silently in the rec room. It said more than any applause ever could. The sun drifted low, stretching golden light across Camp Whitmore like a soft farewell. Its rays caught the tops of the trees and danced along the gravel paths, warming the ground one last time before night crept in. The old American flag, faded but proud, fluttered gently in the breeze atop a splintered pole outside the barracks. Walt sat beneath it on a weather-worn bench, his back straight despite the years. A wooden cane rested at his side, worn smooth from use. He held a folded napkin in one hand, a fresh cup of black coffee in the other. The cup steamed lightly in the cooling air, but Walt's eyes weren't on it. His gaze stretched far ahead, past the edge of the base, down to where the recruits were lined up at the firing range. Young silhouettes against the brightening twilight. Beside him sat Jake, younger, quieter now. His elbows rested on his knees, hands clasped loosely. They said nothing for a long while, just sat, listening to the rhythmic, distant pop of rifles echoing from the range. The shots were steady, broken only by occasional calls, gentle corrections, not harsh orders. Young voices shaping muscle memory, learning what had once been instinct for others. When Walt finally spoke, it was with a voice that rolled low and even, like something grounded and permanent. "Some legacies," he said, "don't shout." Jake turned to look at him, brow creased slightly as he listened. "They just echo," Walt went on, his eyes still forward, "long enough for someone else to hear." Jake let the thought sit there, between them, hanging in the quiet air. He didn't rush a reply. Instead, his gaze drifted across the base, past the firing line to the next generation rising. Shoulders squared, eyes focused, arms steady. "You think they'll remember you?" Jake finally asked, his voice soft. Walt took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Doesn't matter." Then he glanced sideways with a small, knowing smile. "They'll remember how they felt when that shot landed. They'll remember what it meant. And if I did it right, they'll carry it forward without even knowing." The flag cracked lightly above them, catching another gust of wind. Jake nodded slowly, absorbing every word. He didn't need to ask more. The truth had settled in. A legacy wasn't carved into stone or shouted into a microphone. It lived on in the quiet repetition of right actions, watched, learned, and eventually taught. Down at the range, a young recruit's shot rang out, clean, precise. The paper target fluttered briefly in confirmation. Jake smiled. Walt didn't speak, but he gave a single nod and turned his gaze back to the flag above them. He didn't need to say anything. Some stories didn't require words. They just needed to be felt, remembered. As the final light dipped below the horizon and long shadows overtook the base, Walt Lawrence stood and walked away from the bench, his cane gently tapping the earth with each step. The echo of that perfect shot faded, but something else lingered, something deeper. It wasn't just about aim or skill, it was about presence, memory, integrity. A reminder that in a world obsessed with noise, speed, and spotlight, the people who leave the greatest marks often do so quietly, never asking to be seen, only hoping to do the right thing when no one's watching. Walt's story whispered of a different kind of strength, not the kind in uniforms or speeches, but the kind that sits on an old bench with steady hands, calm eyes, and a heart full of purpose, a kind of strength that doesn't need attention to matter. And maybe, especially now, in a world pulling in so many directions, we need less noise, less shouting, more listening, more sitting beside someone and asking without rush, "Tell me your story." Because behind every echo is someone like Walt, a quiet hero who passed something on without ever asking for credit. So who's the Walt Lawrence in your life? Who taught you what strength really looks like, without raising their voice, without asking to be remembered? Was it a parent, a coach, a friend, or someone whose name never made the news but whose presence shaped you? Let their memory speak, not with noise, but with meaning. And when the echoes come, may we be the kind of people who hear them, who carry them on, not for applause, but because they still matter.